Long before a single European vessel ever cast anchor in the waters of Massachusetts Bay, these lands belonged to a people who lived life with breathtaking depth and joy. The Massachusetts tribe, the very people whose name now graces this state, had called these hills and riverbanks home for thousands of years. They fished the shimmering waters, planted their corn in neat rows, and practiced ceremonies rooted in beliefs as ancient as the stones beneath their feet. To them, this land was sacred, not merely in a religious sense, but in the truest, most visceral way. They were woven into its fabric, bound to the earth and to their ancestors in ways that no colonial map could ever capture. But history has never been patient. In the early 17th century, diseases carried unknowingly by European explorers, plagues against which the indigenous peoples had no immunity whatsoever, swept through the native populations like a merciless and invisible storm. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous inhabitants of what we now call New England perished before the great wave of European settlers ever arrived. It was a silent catastrophe, a tragedy so vast, so devastating, that barely anyone remained to tell the tale. History would never, could never forget. When the English finally came ashore, they encountered land that seemed almost eerily prepared for them. Fields already cultivated, paths already worn smooth by 1,000 unseen hands, and a silence heavier than any cry. Boston was built upon a foundation of forgetting, but that truth, raw and uncomfortable as it is, must never be buried. The year was 1630. John Winthrop, a man of broad shoulders, iron faith, and a commanding presence that made even the boldest men lower their eyes, stood on the deck of the ship Arabella, staring out at the raging Atlantic and thinking. He and nearly 1,000 fellow Puritans had turned their backs on England, not out of a thirst for adventure, but out of unshakable conviction. They had left behind the Church of England, a church they believed was still rotting from within with Catholic corruption. They were going to build something entirely new, a community, a city, a divine experiment unlike anything the world had seen. On that very voyage, Winthrop delivered one of the most consequential speeches in American history. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," he declared, his voice rising over the crashing waves. "The eyes of all people are upon us. Be proud of that." Those words echoed across 4 centuries, in the mouths of presidents, from the podiums of Congress, across the pages of history books. But in that moment, they were also a crushing weight, carried on the shoulders of people who had no idea what cold awaited them on the other side of the ocean, what trials destiny had arranged for them. The settlement they founded was first known by its indigenous name, Shawmut, the name the local tribes had given to that jutting peninsula. It was soon renamed Boston in honor of the town of Boston in Lincolnshire, England, from which many of these settlers had come. In those first brutal years, death and disease were constant companions. The winters were ferocious and unforgiving. The houses were small and frigid. Food was scarce, yet the faith of these people burned hotter than any hearth. They believed, and in that belief, they endured. The Puritans built a society in which religion and governance were not merely partners, they were inseparable. The church was not simply a place of worship, it was the seat of power, the source of law, the foundation of identity. Schools, courts, and civil authority all operated beneath the long shadow of theological belief. This structure was not only a constraint, It was the very glue that held this small, fragile community together against the howling winds of the wilderness. Not everyone was content with it, of course, but it held. Decades passed and Boston grew. Its natural harbor, one of the finest along the entire eastern seaboard, a geographic gift that captivated sailors and merchants from across the globe, became the foundation upon which the city stood. Ships arrived from every corner of the world. Fish, timber, and agricultural goods flowed outward. Cloth, spices, and European manufactures poured in. Progress was relentless. By the end of the 17th century, Boston had become the most populous city in British America, larger even than New York and Philadelphia. But this wealth carried a dark and hideous secret. The economy of New England was tangled inextricably with the slave trade. Boston ships participated in the infamous triangular trade of the Atlantic, enslaved human beings brought from Africa to the Caribbean, sugar and molasses carried from the Caribbean to New England, goods shipped from New England to Europe. The great Boston merchants, men whose names are today carved above the entrances of charities and universities, had built their fortunes on the backs of that monstrous chain, convinced perhaps that no one would ever truly know. And there, in that contradiction, lay Boston's eternal paradox, a city that proclaimed liberty, yet bought and sold the liberty of others, a city that howled against the tyranny of the English king, yet closed its eyes to its own cruelties. This was not an exception to history. It was history itself, and Boston lived it in full. If there is a single moment that connects Boston to the very heartbeat of world history, it is the night of December 16th, 1773. A group of men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, moved silently through the darkness and slipped aboard British merchant ships anchored in Boston Harbor, unseen and unheard. What they did next was simple but seismic. They hurled 342 chests of British tea into the cold, black water. The news traveled like wildfire. Many were furious. The world would never quite be the same. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was not merely a protest. It was a declaration. It was the moment a people decided firmly and irrevocably that they would no longer live under laws they had no hand in writing, and that they would hold themselves to a higher principle. The famous cry, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," was born in the streets of Boston and shook every corner of the known world. The British Parliament reacted with punishing legislation that placed Boston under a suffocating siege. But the fire had already been lit. There was no quenching it now. Before that night of tea and defiance, blood had already been spilled. In March of 1770, British soldiers, trapped, frightened, surrounded by a crowd of Boston citizens, faced a wall of rocks and insults. When the shots rang out, and to this day, no one knows exactly who fired first or why, 5 people lay dead. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of Black and Native American heritage who was later honored as the first martyr of the American Revolution. Boston named the event the Boston Massacre and kept the memory alive with fierce, deliberate intention. They would not let the world forget. Revolution was born in Boston and reached its blazing peak there. The battles of Lexington and Concord, the first official armed engagements of the American Revolution, erupted at Boston's very doorstep. Paul Revere rode through the midnight darkness, shouting his legendary warning across the Massachusetts countryside, "The British are coming." Boston was no longer merely a city. It had become a metaphor for resistance, for freedom, for the audacity of ordinary people standing against an empire and refusing to kneel. As the 19th century dawned, Boston was no longer the small, austere, Puritan settlement of its founding, though its population remained largely homogeneous. That changed with a catastrophe that struck across an ocean. Between 1845 and 1852, the Great Potato Famine devastated Ireland. Hundreds of thousands, then millions of starving, desperate Irish men and women poured across the Atlantic in search of survival. Boston was often the first port to receive them. The Irish arrived poor but not weak. They brought with them the Catholic Church, which the Protestant establishment of Boston regarded with barely concealed revulsion. They encountered savage discrimination. Job advertisements openly declared, "No Irish need apply." But they stayed, they worked, they raised families, they built new lives in pursuit of their dreams. And gradually, generation by generation, they gathered power. Boston transformed from the city of Yankee Protestants into something far more layered, more colorful, more complex, even if the tensions remained sharp as broken glass. During this same era, Boston stood at the very forefront of the abolitionist movement, and many were deeply grateful for it. William Lloyd Garrison, a firebrand journalist whose pen burned like a torch, published his newspaper, The Liberator from Boston, screaming that slavery must end, not gradually, not through negotiation, but immediately and absolutely. Many embraced his message with open arms. Frederick Douglass, a man who had seized his freedom through suffering and unbreakable dignity, stood in Boston and delivered speeches that shook souls to their foundations and changed lives forever. The Civil War swept Boston into its currents as well. Thousands of young Boston men marched to the front. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first black combat unit in American history, rose from the city. These men knew they were fighting not only for the Union, but for the very dignity of human existence, and they marched forward with heads held high. Their statue still stands in Boston Common today, cast in iron, but forged from something far more enduring: honor. If Boston possesses one treasure that no other American city can claim with equal ease, it is the life of the mind. Harvard, the oldest university in America, was founded in 1636, a mere 6 years after Boston itself was established. Let that number sink in. 6 years. These people were still wrestling with cold and hunger, still struggling to survive against impossible odds. And yet they were already planning the education of the next generation. What kind of culture produces that? A culture that believes ignorance is more dangerous than any foreign enemy. By the 19th century, Boston had earned the magnificent title of the Athens of America, a reputation that echoed around the globe. The writers and thinkers who emerged from its streets or blossomed within its atmosphere more than justified the lofty name. Ralph Waldo Emerson distilled his philosophy of transcendentalism from these very avenues. Henry David Thoreau retreated to the woods near Boston, full of hope and grand vision, and wrote Walden, a book that would go on to inspire Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and millions of searching young souls across generations yet unborn. Louisa May Alcott, Hawthorne, Longfellow, all drank deeply from the city's extraordinary intellectual air. Technology, too, found its voice in Boston. Alexander Graham Bell made the first telephone call in human history from a Boston laboratory in March 1876. and the world stood dumbstruck, struggling to believe what it had just witnessed. Boston has always been home to minds that challenge the rest of us, that create what does not yet exist, that refuse to be satisfied with what is. That restless, hungry spirit, rarer than any natural resource, has defined this city since its very first days. The 20th century brought seismic political transformation to Boston. The Irish, second and third generation, now, rose to political power at last. James Michael Curley, four-term mayor of Boston, became the symbol of that transfer. A man who carried Boston's Irish working class from the margins to the very center of civic life. Boston politics was never dull. It was passionate, often scandalous, always theatrical, always alive. John F. Kennedy, with a heart that beat unmistakably to a Boston rhythm, rose from an Irish Catholic family who had walked these very streets of Charlestown and Brookline for generations. His grandfather had fled Ireland in desperation. His grandson became President of the United States. Many wept with joy. It is perhaps the most quintessentially American story ever told, from famine and emigration to the Oval Office. The Kennedy Library in Boston stands as a monument to a man who left the world too soon, but left it blazing. But Boston in the 20th century was no stranger to pain. In the 1970s, the school busing crisis, in which black children were bused to white neighborhoods and white children to black neighborhoods in an effort to integrate the city's schools, set Boston on fire. The violence in the streets was real. The hatred was naked and raw. Boston, the city that claimed to be the pioneer of liberty, came face to face with its own deeply embedded racism. It was a wound, a deep, searing wound that has never fully healed. To pretend otherwise would be a lie. Sport is woven into the very soul of Boston. The Red Sox, Boston's beloved baseball team, endured 86 long, agonizing years of waiting under what fans called the curse of the Bambino. When they finally lifted the championship trophy in 2004, the entire city erupted. There was weeping in the streets, the Celtics, the Patriots, the Bruins. These are not just sports teams. They are the living, breathing pulse of Boston's collective identity. Every year on Patriots' Day, a celebration that Boston treats as a sacred holiday, thousands of runners from every nation on earth pound the pavements of this city. The Boston Marathon, held since 1897, is the oldest annual marathon in the world. The finish line on Boylston Street, in the very heart of the city, has always been a place of ecstasy and exhaustion, of triumph and tears. The crowd roars, the runners weep, and life, gloriously imperfect, goes on. April 15, 2013, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the marathon. 3 people were killed, and the grief was felt across the world. More than 260 were wounded. The city reeled with shock. The news spread across every newspaper on the planet. But Boston has always known how to rise from the ashes. A few days later, at a Red Sox game, the announcer stepped to the microphone before the game and said simply, "This is our city." The crowd roared back with something that sounded less like words and more like thunder. The following year, the Red Sox were world champions, and they carried the trophy for the first time to the memorial sites of the bombing. One of the most extraordinary and quietly beautiful things that Boston has managed to achieve is the preservation of its historical memory inside a living, breathing, modern city. The Freedom Trail, a 16-kilometer red line painted on the city sidewalks, leads visitors through 16 historic sites. It begins at Boston Common, the oldest public park in America, winds past the Granary Burying Ground, where Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere lie sleeping, and ends at the USS Constitution, the oldest commissioned warship still in active service in any Navy in the world. But the Freedom Trail is not merely a tourist attraction. Every Boston resident who walks these streets, whether they intend to or not, passes by history with every step. The cafe where you sit and sip your morning coffee may well occupy the very building where revolutionaries gathered 250 years ago, where thousands of human hearts burned with the same impossible dream. This continuity, this sense of layered time, is what sets Boston apart from most American cities. This is a city that has not hidden its age. It has woven its antiquity into its modernity, and the two breathe together. The neighborhood of Beacon Hill, with its 19th century brick townhouses and gas lamps that still glow in the evening, soaked in memory for all who love this city, feels as though time has simply stopped. And yet just below, in downtown Boston, glass towers reach toward the sky with glittering ambition. This contrast is not a contradiction. It is the portrait of a city that has grown slowly and respectfully into itself. Boston never tore itself down and rebuilt from scratch. Boston added to itself layer by layer, story by story. Boston today is one of the most intellectually energetic cities on the face of the earth. The Boston-Cambridge corridor is one of the densest biotechnology and pharmaceutical ecosystems on the planet. Harvard and MIT in Cambridge, sitting directly across the Charles River from Boston, draw the brightest scientific and innovative minds in the world every single year. Many burn with the desire to study there. The startups that are born within this ecosystem sometimes grow into the largest technology companies on Earth, with staggering impact on the way all of us live. Boston's hospitals, Massachusetts General, Brigham and Women's, Boston Children's Hospital, are among the finest medical institutions on the planet. Patients travel to Boston from every corner of the world, from royalty to ordinary people desperate for a chance at survival. The physicians who train within these walls go on to advance the science of medicine across every continent on Earth. The Boston Symphony Orchestra, active since 1881, is considered one of the world's great musical ensembles. The Museum of Fine Arts holds one of the richest art collections in all of America. The Boston Public Library, opened since 1854, one of the first great public libraries in the United States, still welcomes readers beneath its magnificent ancient architecture. Boston is a city of books, a city of music, a city of science, a city of incalculable worth. Boston faces its challenges honestly. The cost of living is staggering. Housing is scarce and expensive. Its Black and Latino communities still wrestle with deep-rooted economic inequality. The traffic is legendary in its misery, hours swallowed whole by congestion. And the winters, just as in the days of the Puritans, can still be merciless. Boston's population stands at around 700,000, but its greater metropolitan area holds more than 5 million souls. The history of Boston is not the story of a city. It is the story of human beings who, every time the ground shook beneath them, stood back up, brushed the dust from their knees, and kept walking towards something better. Puritans who did not flinch before cold or starvation. Revolutionaries who stood before the might of the British Empire and refused to yield. Irish immigrants who fought discrimination with bare hands and steadfast hearts, and eventually carved out their rightful place. Abolitionists who cried out against injustice when it was deeply unpopular to do so. Scientists who burned midnight oil in their laboratories and emerged with discoveries that changed the world. Runners who returned 1 year after the bombing to the starting line. Because that is what you do. John Winthrop declared in 1630 that the eyes of the world were upon them. He could not have known how right he was. And many who heard him embraced those words with everything they had. For 4 centuries, Boston has been not merely a city in Massachusetts, but a symbol of something far larger. The idea that human beings can build something better, that oppression can be resisted, that science, freedom, and human dignity are worth fighting for, and that no force on earth should ever make you surrender them. Boston is not perfect. It never has been. Its history is shot through with failure, with contradiction, with moments when this city betrayed everything it claimed to stand for. But it is precisely that imperfection that makes it real. It is precisely that imperfection that makes it human. A city that clings only to its golden past and flees from its mistakes is a city quietly dying. Boston is not that city. Boston lives with its scars and moves forward anyway. When you cross the Longfellow Bridge over the Charles River and gaze at the modern towers and gleaming glass of Boston's skyline, if you let yourself feel it, truly feel it, you can hear something ancient carried on the wind, the voice of a revolution, the breath of an Irish immigrant gasping and grateful to be alive, the whispered prayer of a Puritan mother by a failing fire, the roar of a crowd refusing to be broken. Boston was always more than a city. It was always an argument, a bold, stubborn, magnificent argument that the future can be better than the past. And 400 years later, the argument continues, loud, unfinished, gloriously, defiantly alive.